Time we have people from all over, from UMass, from different campuses, from different areas from around the area. So we wanted to welcome you. My name is Keenan Mitchell.
I'm Allison Root.
And we are part of UMass Cornerstone, which is a campus ministry here on campus. So we're super excited you guys are here. It's going to be a super special time tonight, and so definitely feel free to grab a seat, make yourself cozy. There's going to be a couple of different things going on tonight. We're going to have the lecture portion. And then afterwards, we're going to have an open Q&A. So if during the lecture you feel like you have some questions, please keep your hands down. And then once the open Q&A starts, feel free to write them down. And then you're more than welcome to ask. And right now, we're going to introduce John.
So we're really excited to welcome John to our campus tonight. John Beggs went to high school in the Chicago area. He received his BS and Master's in Engineering Physics from Cornell University. He then taught math and science at Samoa College while in the U.S. Peace Corps. He later obtained a PhD from Yale University and did postdoctoral research at the National Institutes of Health. Beggs has been a professor of physics at Indiana University since 2003, where his lab uses ideas from physics to explore how networks of neurons process information. Beggs and his wife Sarah have 2 teen daughters and live in the Indianapolis area. He was baptized in 1990 in the New York City Church of Christ, and we're really excited to learn from what he has researched and just from somebody who has been a Christian for so long and really unites the ideas of science and faith.
Cool. So let's all give a warm welcome to John Beggs.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm glad so many people showed up. I think when Lee first put this out, he said that John Beggs will prove the concrete existence of the soul. I can't do that, man. The PR is a little too much. All I can do is tell you sort of my journey and trying to reconcile Christianity with the science that I do. So that's the perspective that I'm going to take. But I appreciate the challenge, Lee, wherever you are. So what I'm going to talk about are these things here. Briefly, I'll talk a little bit about science and faith and how there's some apparent tension there. Then I'll talk about reductionism in neuroscience, the idea that everything can be explained by the smallest scales. But in contrast to that, in physics, and I'm in a physics department, there's this idea of emergence, that once you get lots of similar units together, you have some sort of thing that pops out that is different. And that can have its own properties that are different from what you see at a smaller scale. And then finally, what I'll try to do is have a soulful reconciliation, sort of merge these things together and see how they can be thought of together as one unified whole. So, let's talk about science and faith. And so here's a question. Does anybody know what these are? Okay. When you see them, does it cause pain?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. And this is how, when I go to family reunions and people say, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I teach physics. Everybody kind of like recoils. But to me, when I was an undergrad, what I really loved was these are Maxwell's equations. And they describe how the electric field and the magnetic field work together to allow light waves to exist. And I'll really be vulnerable with you. When I first saw these things, I thought they were so beautiful that I wept. Okay? So now that's a nerdy moment, all right?
Thanks for sharing.
You physics lovers. Now, then I went to graduate school and I studied the brain, and now here is a brain observing light. Okay, so this is light in physics form. This is the brain somehow having a perception of light. And then I studied how neurons interact, and I wanted to blend these two things together. But even before that, I was a Christian. And one of the things that Jesus says is, I am the light of the world. And I believe that that's very important. But how do I merge these things together? Because often people think that science and faith are at odds with each other. So if you go back to ancient Greece or the Romans, they thought that the sun was dragged across the sky by Apollo. All right? But then we realized the earth actually turns. So science killed Apollo. Will neuroscience kill the idea of the soul or even God? This is the tension that's there. And that's what I want to kind of address and just inviting you into looking about these things the way I've seen them. And you know, you can of course differ, and that's fine. You can ask me questions at the end. So if I'm going to have soul in the title, I might as well say at least the aspects of the soul that I want to address. So the things that I want to talk about is the soul should be something that's immaterial. It's not made out of matter. It is the source of our will and how we make decisions. And lastly, it can exist after our bodies and brains die. These are the three things that I'll address. There are many, many other things that you could want to talk about when it comes to the idea of a soul, but I'll just touch on these. And like I said, this isn't a complete proof. This is just inviting you to think about these things. All right, so let's move to reductionism in neuroscience. So this is the dominant paradigm, the way that most neuroscientists look at the world, and almost everybody in all the departments I've ever been in have viewed things this way. Here's the rough idea, just to start it out. The brain is sort of a machine, and what you have are inputs that come in, and then they go into the brain, and these sensory inputs are processed, and then these things go out to touch muscles, and they cause actions. And the whole goal of neuroscience, in a sense, is just to kind of trace this input-output relationship using laws of physics and biology to explain the entire existence of our brain, what it does, how it feels, all its perceptions in terms of a science. That's not a bad goal. I'm not against it. And this is dipping into the brain a little bit. What we see are lots of neurons. These are some neurons that I filled when I was a graduate student with dye. And I really fell in love with this because it took me so many hours to do it. And what you can see, if you zoom in a little bit, this is a branch of the neuron. This is the cell body down here. You see all these little bumps coming out. Maybe you can just barely see them. Each of these little bumps are spines, and this is where they receive synapses. And the average neuron in the cortex receives somewhere around 7,000 synapses. So there's lots and lots of connections. And the other thing that I did when I was a graduate student is we would take these really thin electrodes and we would poke them down into the brain until we rupture through one of the brain cells, and then we break in and we become electrically united with it, and we can record their voltages. And although you all have neurons, you might not know how they work. The way they work is they have little voltage pulses. And so each voltage pulse is called an action potential, and what it does is it's a digital signal that one neuron will send out to another neuron. That's the only way they talk. They don't sing high-pitched or low-pitched. They can give more action potentials, or they can create a pattern of them, but each action potential is the same height and the same width, roughly speaking. So it's a digital signature of some activity in the neuron. And these neurons, what they'll do is once one of these neurons is active, here's the cell body and those are the branches, it'll travel down this axon, it'll go to a synapse here. And if this is strong enough, what it will do is it will cause enough current to flow into this neuron to cause it to also fire an action potential. And so that's kind of what the brain is. It's a series of neurons that all produce action potentials and talk to each other. Now this little junction here, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it. It's called a synapse. You've probably heard of it before. And here's my little diagrammatic picture of it. In between this little cleft, this is what would be the presynaptic neuron over here. Here's the postsynaptic neuron. There's all these little molecules of transmitter. And so transmitters come through. Usually it's something like glutamate or GABA. These are different excitatory and inhibitory transmitters. They've been heavily studied by people. People spend their entire careers just studying how transmission occurs across the synapse. And it's a good career. People have won multiple Nobel Prizes just talking about how this mechanism works. Now what does a neuron do with all these inputs? It basically receives as many of them as are active. It'll sum them all up, and basically if it's over a threshold, then the neuron will fire a spike, an action potential, and if it's not, the neuron will just be silent. This is kind of the logic of the brain. This is how it works. This is a mini crash course of the mechanism behind your brain.
Wow.
So now, what about these guys? Each of these neurons will receive anywhere from 100 to 1,000 or 10,000 inputs, and it'll make as many outputs, so it's a heavily connected network. Here's a real quick picture of something we've looked at in our lab. We can record hundreds of neurons at a time, and we can look at the different functional connections between them to estimate where the synapses are. So it's a dense network, and there's about 10 to the 10th neurons in the human brain. So there's a lot of this stuff, and each one has about 1,000 to 10,000 connections, so it's a very densely interconnected network. All of them using synapses, all of them using action potentials, all of them very well understood by processes in the lab. So this is all kind of under the purview of science. We think we understand how it all works. Yeah?
In your diagram, each line represents a synapse
in the diagram, each line represents a synapse. Yeah, so what we've done is basically if this neuron fires and it consistently, let's say, drives this neuron down here at a certain time delay, then we can infer that there's a connection. We have statistical tests, and I can go into that in more detail. So yeah, these are some of the connections. And the green subnetwork right here is what's carrying 80% of the information flow. But that's just an example to just show you what the networks look like. Now, these networks can perform logical functions. So the brain computes, we know that. Well, how can it compute? So let's take this situation here. We got neuron A and neuron B, and they both send inputs to neuron C. Now, let's imagine we have different types of thresholds for neuron C. So if neuron C has a threshold of 2, then it will only send out a pulse if both A and B are on at the same time. So this would be the logical AND. So the way computers are built is by using these things called AND gates. You can also make something called an OR gate if I change the threshold. If the threshold is only 1, now if A or B fire, then C will fire. I'm not going to get deep into the details, but I just want to show you that all the logic gates that you would imagine in a computer can be found in the brain using action potential synapses in the underlying network. And so a slice of cortex has a whole bunch of stuff going on like that, lots of neurons, lots of connections. And the cortex is the crowning achievement of, I guess, human biology. Maybe you've heard this, that we're only 1% different genetically from chimps. Have you heard that? Right? And those genes are not all involved with hair on the body. Those genes are mostly involved with cortex. They're mostly, all the genes that we have that are different from the chimp are responsible for making our cortex much bigger. We have 400% the cortex that the chimp has. So, and this would be 4 sheets of paper, or if you're a student, 1 large pizza box. Okay? So the lowly mouse has only a postage stamp, this kind of monkey has about an index card, and the chimp has about 1 sheet of paper. So the cortex is huge, and it really can't get any bigger because it's limited by the birth canal. And when I saw my wife give birth, that made a deep impression on me. You can't make the cortex any bigger. Right? The only way you can fit the cortex in is if you crinkle it up, and that's why it's all wrinkly and everything, shoved in there. Okay? So we're pushing the very limits of the pelvis. All right? The cortex is expanded as large as it can possibly be. Now, what does the cortex do? By the way, cortex means bark in Latin. It's just the outer bark of the brain. And this is where all these cells are connected. The cortex has lots of different regions, and just a really rough guide of it is this. The sensory stuff generally happens at the back, and as you go more toward the front, you have more action stuff. Okay, so in the very back, we have visual cortex, so this is where the visual inputs are processed. Over here, you can have audition, parts of hearing. You can also have then speaking up here. There's an area here that recognizes faces. So the position of things in space is this pathway up here, and the type of thing that you see in space is processed by this pathway down here. So there's all these different regions in the brain, and somewhere in there, there's a little region for planning things up here in the front. This is planning, and right up here is where motor cortex is. This controls sort of your movements. And in terms of planning, there's a little part up here that thinks about how you're going to pay for college for your kids. And for us, that started out as a little pea-sized thing, and now it's about most of this red lobe for us. So that's what we're worried about. So the cortex has specialized functions, and we know this because if you damage a certain part of the cortex, you'll lose that function. And so different functions are localized in different locations. And so the cortex is responsible for lots of our thoughts, and we can map it out. Now, to step back after this quick whirlwind tour, I just want to remind you that there's lots of scales that are involved here. Okay? So we're not only just talking about the cortex, but we're talking about networks of neurons, synapses, and then even down in here, here's serotonin, a neurotransmitter that peaks after you eat turkey, right? And then we've got the genes. So all these different things are heavily studied by modern neuroscience, and each level tends to talk to the other level nearby. And people talk and say, oh, we're going to share our results about genes and how that influences the production of neurotransmitters and so forth. And so science is engaged in this giant enterprise of trying to link the scales together. Now, the usual way that science works, though, is the following. The scientific method is, what you do is you go in and you manipulate low and you observe its effects on high. So one thing to do, for example, is to create something like a knockout mouse, or a mouse that has a gene that's inserted, a transgenic mouse. So you can knock out a gene or you can insert a gene, and if you do that, you play down here, and you create a mouse that would have, let's say, Alzheimer's. And so way up here, its behavior, its memory would be affected. And so this is the typical way of studying things, because it's easier, relatively speaking, to go in and knock out a gene. Another thing you can do is you can manipulate the levels of transmitter in an animal. You can increase the level of serotonin, let's say, or you can increase the level of dopamine, or you can block dopamine, and then you can see how that changes its behavior. So what people typically do is manipulate down low and then observe things up high. This is easier in science. It's the scientific method. You make one manipulation, you have an experimental group, and then you don't manipulate over here, you got a control group, and now you observe the difference. So that doesn't mean that that's the only way the brain works, but that means that's how most of neuroscience is done. And so most of the people who practice neuroscience are reductionists. they think that all the action is occurring down here, because this is where science typically performs its experiments. Now, this idea of reductionism is a very good one. It's had huge success. Lots and lots of success. So let me just say a couple things really quickly. People have found that this particular gene, FOXP2, is necessary for language. If you knock it out, or you find families where it's not present, they have great difficulty forming sentences. Okay, so FOXP2 is very important for language. That's a gene that affects language. Huntington's disease, we know this, is 35 CAG repeats in the Huntington protein. So this is exactly what Huntington's disease is. A woman named Nancy Wexler had it in her family. She knew that it had extreme cognitive deficits, and she heroically went down to South America to trace families that had Huntington's disease, and she found the gene. And she basically then said, okay, once we find this gene, now we can develop treatments that will help people to not have Huntington's disease. So that's a triumph of reductionism. Another thing, let's just say here, reduced serotonin. We know this probably. If you have low serotonin levels, you're probably depressed. Okay? How can we fix that? We can give you Prozac, and that will increase levels of serotonin. You will almost always feel better. This is amazing. It's helped society tremendously. Okay? So reductionism is very important. Elevated levels of oxytocin promotes animal bonding, and then it also spikes when humans are in love. Okay, so oxytocin has a lot to do with love. This is an interesting thing to know. We also know that synaptic enhancements underlie memory. So when synapses get bigger, a particular pathway is enhanced, and you'll use that memory more often. These are all good things. And lastly, I think I already alluded to this, if you lesion primary visual cortex, you will impair vision. If you lesion the hippocampus, you will not be able to store any new memories. So that, we don't typically go in and do this to undergraduates, right? But what happens is people will have lesions done to them. So there was this guy, HM, and he had epilepsy surgery done to him where they resected his hippocampus on both sides. It's a part of the brain. They wanted to stop his epilepsy. The good news was it stopped his epilepsy. The bad news was he could not store any new memories. And so if someone would come in and say hi to him, he'd meet them and so forth. They could go out 10 minutes later, they'd come in, he didn't know who they were. He kept thinking President Kennedy was still President Kennedy, he was in charge of everything. So this is the kind of understanding that we get from reductionism, from breaking something apart into smaller units and then understanding what the functions of those things are. So this is the tour. And now basically to summarize this part, the idea is that every higher scale is dependent on a lower scale. All your thoughts are somehow dependent on serotonin or oxytocin or your synapses or your genes. Okay? And mind then is just a product of your brain. We understand how the brain works because we can build it up like Lego, and we know what the product is. It's mind. And so there's absolutely no need for a soul. So if anyone says, oh, well, there's got to be a soul, we're humans, I believe that there's a soul, most neuroscientists would just politely not say anything, but inside they would laugh at you. Okay? So that's the view that most people have. All right, now let's go to, question.
Are you saying that reductionism is sort of like a reason why someone might say, because when you see the effect on the bottom part of the chain to the top, to the higher level?
And am I saying that reductionism is a reason why someone would say there's not a soul?
Or might go that way?
Yeah, no, I definitely think reductionism leads to that type of thinking. Absolutely. You know, and I've had dialogues with lots of colleagues, and this is the general direction it goes. And I think, I don't disagree with this. I think it's a wonderful paradigm. I just think that when you say there's no soul, well, let's hear the other side first. There's more to come here. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is something called emergence in physics. And to discuss that, I've got to discuss a little bit of our research and how I got into this sort of thing. So here's a picture of our lab from a few years ago. We had a lab party. And all the work I'm giving you here is done by graduate students. All professors do is go around and give talks and earn money by submitting grants. And it's really crazy because we get all kinds of credit, but really it's these people who do all the sweat and the blood and the tears. Okay, that's truth. And if you're a graduate student, you can say amen. Amen. Right. That doesn't mean we're going to pay you more, but I just want to give you credit. All right, so what do? We take a little chunk of brain from a mouse or a rat, and the rat is fully anesthetized. There's lots of regulations to make sure that it does not feel any pain at all. There's more care taken in putting these rats down than there is in putting the cows down that lead your cheeseburgers. So there. Okay? So we do everything we can to try to make sure that we're treating the animals humanely, and each animal is precious. So here's a piece of cortex right here, and here's the hippocampus. And we grow these little guys on cultures. We grow them in an incubator for like 2 weeks. They're little active pieces of brain tissue. And we flip them over on a filter paper, and we put them on an electrode array, which you can see some of the wires coming out here. I'll get into it in a minute. But here's the little piece of brain, happily computing away, but hopefully not conscious and hopefully not feeling anything. But it's got electrical impulses, and they're going around in this little network. And we have an electrode array that's fancy, and it's got lots of electrodes, 512, so that lets us eavesdrop on the electrical activity of lots of neurons as they talk. And here's a quick little movie of a voltage pulse. Let's see if I get this. You should see down in this corner these voltage spikes right here. Those are the voltage pulses from individual neurons that are on this array. This is the display. And let me get to the next slide. In the next slide, you'll see a cascade of activity. Whoops, that's not the next one. Let's go to that. Okay, here's well, that's a little loud. Cascade of activity. You should see a bunch of these electrodes light up.
I wish I could get rid of that glare.
Oh, this is my graduate student, Josh. So he records it, you see a whole bunch of things light up, and then you'll see a couple little more, and then it'll go off again. And I asked him to send me a movie of this sort of stuff in the lab. And so you see, we get these cascades of activity. So let me talk about this in a little bit more detail. So if we have a piece of tissue here, we've got 512 electrodes. These are what the electrodes are arranged like. And on an individual channel, we get something like this, a vertical tick mark. That's one of those action potentials I was talking about, right? That's the voltage pulse of an individual neuron. And what you saw in the previous movie was everything kind of lighting up at once. But that's only at our time scale. At our time scale, it looks like everything's simultaneously active. But if you zoom in, 1/10 of a second looks like this. So there's all these little cascades going on. So it's very detailed. And some of these cascades repeat themselves. They're almost like they're stable for 10 hours at a time. We've recorded that and published on this stuff. And so there's lots of intricate activity in there when you zoom in and you partition the time into smaller and smaller bins. And what you can see when you have something like that is, let's just call this an avalanche. So you'll have a frame in the movie where there's no activity, then you have several frames where there's consecutive activity, and then it's bracketed by another frame that has no activity. And we can just count the size of this. It's 11 neurons get activated. And now we can do statistics, simple statistics on it. And so now if I plot the probability of observing an avalanche of a certain size, and this is in powers of 10, and here's the sequence size, this is in powers of 10, this is probability, and this is size. If I shuffle the data, if it were random, I would get something that looks like that. But what we actually get is something more like this. What does that mean? Let me try to explain. You shouldn't be surprised unless you're a scientist. But if you're a scientist, this is interesting. What this means is that this distribution has a very long tail. It follows a straight line in log-log space. It's like the Richter scale. So you've heard of let's say a Richter scale 10 earthquake. That would be devastating, huge, well, enormously huge. And then you've heard of Richter scale 9 earthquake. Do you know the difference between the two? One is 10 times more powerful than the other. Every time you go down by one scale in the Richter scale, you're going down by 1 power of 10 in magnitude. But you're also changing the probability. So if you go to a Richter scale 10, that happens very, very rarely. A Richter scale 9 happens 10 times more often. A Richter scale 8 happens 100 times more often. A Richter scale 7 happens 1,000 times more often. So you get the idea. So the really weak earthquakes would be down here, and they happen very often, because here's how often they happen, and here's how strong they are. And the very, very big earthquakes would be way down here, and they happen very, very rarely. Things that follow a straight line like this is called a power law. There's systems that are complex. There's systems that are poised at a phase transition point. This is an example of what we would call an emergent property. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a minute. The probability of the size of an avalanche scales as the size of the avalanche raised to some exponent like this. And I can tell I'm already getting too mathematical, so let me just speed ahead. All right, so when we first saw these things, we called them neuronal avalanches because all the equations that govern avalanches could be directly applied to the brain. All the avalanches that you would find in snow or mountain or even earthquakes could be applied directly to the brain. The physics from that system, those systems, could be directly imported to the brain. So that was cool for us. We thought that was really neat. And now what controls this stuff? Let me show you. This is a movie by a colleague of mine, Olaf Sporns. And what he's got is he changes the connectivity. Remember we talked about the connections of the neurons. Each of these dots is a neuron, and now these are little local connections that he puts on here, and this sphere goes around, and then he activates the simulation just to show you the type of activity that you get. And so it looks kind of random. If they only have local connectivity, and these neurons aren't connected to faraway neighbors, you just get random activity like this. What he's going to show next is what happens if you have long-range connections. So now he's got no more connections here than before, it's just that now they go further, so it looks like a ball of yarn is denser. So now these neurons can connect to everybody all over the place, and what does the activity look like? It's very different. Now the activity is very synchronized. When one neuron goes off, it contaminates everybody, kind of like coronavirus, right? So it just spreads instantly because we're really connected right now. You can take a flight from Beijing to Washington or whatever, or at least you could. Okay, now there's a difference, and this is what the brain is connected like. You have certain local connections, and you have some long-range connections like this. This is the brain's pattern of activity. And this drastically changes the way the activity spreads on the sphere. And once it kicks in, you can see that it's different. It's not just random, and it's also not just totally synchronized. It's more like you have little things traveling around, pulses that move back and forth. And this is, in fact, what we see when we slow down the movies, and we can plot it out, and we get our avalanches, we get exactly this type of activity. Okay? So the connectivity of the brain is just such to allow the most complex activity to be there. All right, now I want to show you this movie, and I hope I can toggle between the two things here appropriately. Let me go way off to the side here. Okay, I want to show you this. We're talking about emergent properties and patterns of activity that can happen. So here's a flock of starlings. And it's beautiful for one. And you see these pulses. And these pulses travel back and forth. And scientists have been very interested in this. How does this happen? This is an emergent property of some sort. The whole blob, the shape it has, the little pulses that travel within the blob. And now we kind of, before they come and they injure the photographer. Let me go to the next slide. Now, humans do similar types of things. Okay? Humans do this. Okay? So let me show you this real quick. This was taken at a Wisconsin football game. And let me toggle here. And I'll show you this real quick. So this is the wave. Let's see. Oh, I got to get into here and go up here. Where did my cursor go? Okay, over here. All right. Let's go up to this one. And let's go to this. And so now you see the wave here for a second.
So when does it go fast? Like when they hit the limit, when they go at key action?
Let me see where it goes fast. So it starts to come fast, I think, right around here. Hold on.
Get ready.
Somehow not quite as elegant as the Father Son. But no insult to Badgers fans if you're out there. So let me get back to this. But this is also an emergent property. So this is some way of humans getting together and creating this thing called the wave. And what I want to do is contrast this intentionally, very intentionally, with this molecular view. That it's all about serotonin, or it's all about the synapse, or the things down there. What happens when you get a bunch of people and you put them together and they interact in new ways? You connect them in a certain way to have the activity be just right, to have this emergent property. So now, let me ask a few questions here. So here are a few questions. Does the wave have a length? Well, yeah. It's got some certain width. Does it have a velocity? Yeah. Notice that the size of the wave is different from the size of a person. Notice that the speed of the wave is different from the speed of a person. It's a different entity. It's made up of people, but it has its own properties. Is the wave made of matter? Yeah, sort of. It's made of people, but it's also different from people. You see what I'm getting at? It's not exactly just a thing that you hold your hand and go, here's a molecule of serotonin. It's not the same thing. Now, can you understand the wave by taking an undergraduate, paying them lots of money, having them sit in your office and go, okay, stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. And then develop a model. No, the only way to really observe this thing is to go to its scale and see it as it acts. In some sense, taking it apart, breaking it into a smaller unit, destroys the very thing itself.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if the audience is speaking Spanish or English, or does it matter if they're wearing shorts or pants. Maybe it matters if they're drinking beer, I don't know, maybe too much. But the point I want to make here is that lots of lower level details have no effect whatsoever on the wave, right? It's not as if everybody's got to be wearing Puma sneakers for this thing to work. And often what happens in reductionism is the idea is that, oh, this molecule or this gene drives everything up. No, actually there's something called universality in physics, and what we know is that some higher level phenomena, particularly emergent properties, are not dependent on the lower level details. It doesn't mean that every lower level detail has no effect whatsoever. It means some of them don't. Some of these emergent properties will happen even if you were to say, let's change the spacing of the seats. Now we could build a stadium, and I don't know if I could get funded for that, but if you could build a stadium and change the spacing of the seats, right? You'd see if the wave would still work. Probably it would, even if you change the spacing to some extent. Okay, can the wave exert influence on lower level things? Yeah, as it goes around the stadium, it can cause an individual person to stand up or go down. It can cause somebody's beer to be spilled on somebody else, right? So it can do things at the lower scale. Can immaterial things affect material things? Is that possible?
Yeah.
I'm trying to argue yes. Okay, now you can disagree with me, that's fine. It's actually more fun if you disagree with me, but let's save it for the end. And then finally, this idea, can the mind affect the body? If even a mind exists, could it happen? I'm trying to open your mind up to the idea that there are things in physics that are emergent properties that make this idea of what we'll call downward causation highly likely. In fact, it's studied and assumed in many circumstances. So what we have is this. It is possible for the upper scales to actually drive the lower scales. It doesn't just go from here up to there. This is how science typically is done because these things are easy to manipulate. But it does not mean that this doesn't drive that. It can. Let me give you a simple example. Here's Wilder Penfield. So he's a guy who did brain surgery on lots of people and started electrically stimulating regions in the brain. And I don't know if you know this or not, but very often neurosurgery is done while the patient is awake. And so what you do is you stimulate to find out where the speech centers are, and the neurosurgeon doesn't want to remove the speech center for obvious reasons, but also they'd be sued, right? I mean, if the patient comes out and can't speak, it's like, what did you do? We remove, neurosurgeons remove other areas, but just other areas that you don't know anything about after you get out of surgery. You are missing something, but you don't know that you're missing it, okay? But they'll remove the speech center only on accident. So what they do is they go in and they stimulate different regions. And what Wilder Penfield did is he went in and he stimulated this region of the motor cortex. And along the motor cortex, there's basically what's called a homunculus, a little man stretched out across the surface of the brain, so that if you stimulate here, for example, you'll move the hand. If you stimulate here, you'll move the mouth, in different parts. Okay? And what he was able to do is go in and stimulate people's arms. And he could get people to raise their arms. He'd get them to raise their leg and do all kinds of things like that. But when he stimulated a person's arm, he'd ask them, do you feel your arm go up? They go, yes, but I didn't raise my arm, they would say. He could drive their arm, but they never got the feeling that they were doing it. They felt that they were distinct and separate from the stuff he was stimulating. So let's talk about evidence of downward causation. So if I decide to give up smoking, my nicotinic cholinergic receptors will be reduced to number. So by a decision of my will, I can change the receptors in my brain. Likewise, if I practice gratitude, and this is studied, serotonin levels will go up in my body. These receptors, these neurotransmitters will become more prevalent. If I learn a new language, synapses in my speech areas will change. At the synaptic scale, things will change. If I play violin from a very early age, the area in my cortex that's devoted to violin will expand and become bigger. People, interestingly, who pick up violin at later stages don't have that expansion. So if you want a prodigy, drive them early. Be a tiger mom, right? No, I'm not giving advice. I'm just pointing out this is how it works. So here's the idea. Higher level emergent phenomena can drive lower level things. And as we said, some lower level features don't matter. They don't matter. And so this idea that the bottom is always driving the top is not, strictly speaking, always true. Okay? So that's the contrast. I've given you all the stuff about reductionism, and I've given you all this sort of stuff about emergentism. Now, can I merge it together? Can I somehow give you a picture that will tell you something that makes sense? All right, and now here I feel like I'm very insecure. I'm on shaky ground. I'm going to start talking like a humanities professor, like my cousin Jim. Okay, so here, I'm going to go into the humanities, and what I want you to do is look at that word, and I want you to think, what is the meaning of that word right now? Just think about it. You can see it, it's small. There's a reason why it's small. Okay? What is the meaning of that? Now I zoom out a little bit. Now, what is the meaning of this? Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you. I don't know, what's he talking about? Okay? If you will thank me, he replied, let it be for yourself alone, that the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on. I shall not attempt to deny, but your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe, I thought only of you. It's getting a little different now, right? As you zoom out, the word you has different meanings. And if you zoom out further, and trust me, I'm not going to read this in dramatic language, this is from Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, my wife's favorite novel. And if you know what's going on, if you zoom out and you get the context, so Mr. Darcy is this very wealthy guy, and Elizabeth is this very poor girl, but highly intelligent and ambitious and witty and everything. And she's got a lot of pride. She doesn't want to admit that she loves him. And he's got a lot of prejudice toward people in the lower classes. And if you zoom out even further, what you realize is that England at that time was a very classist society, and that all the people in Jane Austen's class were worried about marrying up. And so the only way they could get out of that system was, could I marry somebody who was further up? And if you go out even further, it's the idea of true love based on someone you really know versus all the culture and all the other people who tell you you can't get married. It's the same thing in the Jets versus the Sharks. It's the same thing in so many different stories that you see. It's a love story. Love versus all the things that oppose it. That word you is pivotal in the book. That word you carries huge weight. How can you understand it? You can't if you only look at that. You can only understand it if you zoom out and zoom out and zoom out and get the full context. The full context is exactly what we need if we're going to understand ourselves. If we zoom in and we think that all we are is a bunch of genes and a bunch of molecules and a bag of chemicals, what are you worth? If you liquidate a human body and you just sell the chemicals, it's worth something like $10, right? It's the arrangement, stupid, right? You know how they say it's the economy, stupid? It's the arrangement. It's the arrangement of how we're stuck together. It's this emergent property that makes us different. So if I were to go back to this, the broader context is this. Not only do we have genes and chemicals and circuits, but we also have experiences, we have behavior, we have values, and we even have beliefs. And this whole chain is exchanging things at all scales. All the scales can interact with each other. One scale does not have privilege over another. So, based on the history of science, these are the easiest things to manipulate, and these up here are the hardest things to manipulate. It's very hard to manipulate people's beliefs. You can't just say, hey, look, you guys believe in God and you guys don't. Let's meet up again in 20 years and see how you did. You can't do that, right? You can't run. It's unethical, right? But people wouldn't really go with it. Okay, but the other thing is that things way down at the lower scale, I will venture to say this, are less meaningful. And the things up at the higher scale are more meaningful. I can't manipulate them, I can't quantify them, I can't understand them as well, but I do know this. That's important. My synapses, sure, I don't want you taking them away, but I could lose a few, and probably every time I have a beer, I do. Okay? So those things are relatively less important. Okay? So let's revisit some of these things with this new appreciation of context. Let's revisit. Okay? So let's talk about oxytocin, the thing that skyrockets when you're in love. Okay? And I love this. They have the chemical thing here, and they have two people madly in love here. So we're contrasting the two scales, right? Okay, so it's the love chemical, and what you can even do is buy a necklace that has it here. Okay, that says, this is love, this is love, awesome. Give me this stuff, right? I just want to snort it, it's so good. Okay, so let's talk about this. I was actually in a debate once. I was in a debate with a guy, and he was telling me that oxytocin is love. And as always happens at the moment, you're stumped, and you have no idea what to say. I just knew it was wrong, but I had nothing to say, and all these people were looking at me, and I'm like, ugh. And I went home and I couldn't sleep and I thought about this a lot. So just give me the chance to unload it now. All right, here's my response that I would have given to him. Oxytocin, if oxytocin is love, then what if I have a vial of oxytocin? Is it in love with itself? What if I pour it on a rock? Is the rock in love? No, John. You have to have an animal that has oxytocin receptors. Okay, let me have a worm that's got oxytocin receptors and inject oxytocin into the worm. Would the worm then be in love? Maybe not. Okay, let's give you a higher level animal. Let's give you a rat. I'll inject oxytocin into the rat. Would the rat then be in love? He goes, yes. But what if I had the rat eating another rat? Would that rat be in love while it was experiencing oxytocin? Maybe that rat would think it's in love. So you see, the context matters. Not only is it just the chemical, it's the receptors, it's the animal that has to have cognition, and it's also the situation of the animal. What is love? This is love. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. I think that's a valid description of love too. And I think it's more meaningful. Let's take another look. What about depression and serotonin? It is true if people are depressed that if we take serotonin, and I've been on antidepressants before, just to let you know, I was on them for 2 years. It helped me tremendously. It reduced my anxiety. I felt so much better. So it works. It works even better, though, if you have talk therapy. If you're talking to someone who understands your problems, who's able to discuss things with you. And it actually works better than talk therapy alone or serotonin alone. There's a synergistic effect. So that adding them together is more than just the sum of the two individuals. They synergistically increase. But what about this? There's a book by Tim Keller, and this author, he's describing a class that one of his congregation members went to. They were taking a class at Harvard, and they got to this situation where this therapist was describing the patient clearly has intense anger toward his mother and needs to resolve this. And so then the people in the class said, okay, well, how do we resolve this? And he goes, well, that's for the patient to decide. And they said, well, what about having the patient forgive his mother? And the therapist goes, stop, no. Don't push your values on the patient. Don't push your values on the patient. You're supposed to be neutral. The question is there really such a thing as neutrality in such a situation? What really works? Is it just increasing your serotonin levels, or could it also involve forgiveness, reconciliation, and cleansing? Is there some other higher level thing that can actually drive the serotonin? Anecdotally, I know people, including myself, when I forgive, I feel way better. When I decide to forgive, when my mind decides to forgive, I'm sure it changes my serotonin levels, right? Is that the only thing to it? Is this? I don't think so. Let me show you another one, and we're almost done. Here's some work that was done a few years ago, and I saw it at the Society for Neuroscience conference. This in the next slide. This guy, Michael Persinger, and what he would do is he would take a magnet and he'd bring it near somebody's left temporal lobe, and he'd stimulate it. And when he stimulated there, people would feel like there was the presence of another person near them. So they'd feel some being that was near them. And so he basically said you could generate some sort of religious sensation. And all kinds of people at the conference were really excited about this. They thought, wow, this is really intense. Follow-up studies by this guy, V.S. Ramachandran. What he basically said is people with temporal lobe epilepsy will have religious hallucinations. They'll suddenly start to believe in God. They'll think that God exists, and it's really just an electrical storm in their temporal lobe. After the seizures, he did studies on this. People were more prone to prefer religious words over erotic words. Control group people preferred erotic words. And so the idea is this: religion just seems to be nothing but some sort of disruption in your temporal lobe. That's all there is to it. That's all it could be. And I talked with a bunch of people who were hovering around this poster at the Society for Neuroscience meeting, and this is the conclusion they were going away from with it. Maybe you can see the flaw. I don't know. And so let me just kind of post a counterexample. Let's talk about the wife module, not the God module. Okay? So when I think of my wife, or when I see my wife in the flesh, my wife's name is Sarah, when I see her, my visual cortex is stimulated in certain ways. If you were to now take me at some other place and stimulate my cortex in that same way, I would see an image of my wife. We know that that's how the brain works. Does that mean that my wife doesn't exist? No. That says nothing at all about whether my wife exists or not. That just says you've stimulated the same circuitry that is actually stimulated when I'm in the presence of my wife. So for all we know, this has nothing to do with saying that God is not there. What it does say is that there's a certain part of our brain that is receptive to the idea of God. It doesn't say anything about whether God exists or not. Okay? It does not disprove the existence of God. But this is the kind of thing that you see often going on. What people do is they take something at a low level, like serotonin or oxytocin, or they take some module and they say, now that says something about what's upstairs. It says that love is not patience and kindness. Love is this chemical. Good mental health has nothing to do with forgiveness. It's just serotonin. God is nothing but a stimulation pattern. You see how the battle is going on between the lower levels and the upper levels. People often will go to the lower levels to try to invalidate the upper levels. I don't think it works that way. Okay, and I just said that part here. Here's one last thing. Free will. So many years ago, there was an experiment done by Benjamin Libet, and his experiment went as follows. What he did is he took patients and he said, okay, I want to figure out what it is that causes a person to will to raise their finger. So he said, I've got this clock and the second hand's going around and around, and you just decide whenever you want, raise your finger. And when you raise your finger, note the time of the clock. Okay, so he was able to record the muscle in the person's hand. He was able to record the time the person said that they first thought that there was the intention to move, and he put electrodes on the scalp and he could see the brain waves. And what he found was this, and it was quite shocking. What he found was that this thing called the readiness potential, this was the brain signal, began to pick up 500 milliseconds before the person made the decision in 200 milliseconds, and then somewhere here they actually acted, and here was the muscle potential, something like that. So this readiness potential happened even before the person said they made the decision. Now you might say, well, there was a time lag, well, they controlled for the time lag and all that sort of stuff. And so for many years, people said, aha, that's it, that's the proof. And so all the reductionists would go, there's no such thing as free will. Snap out of it. It's just your brain decides before you do, and then you just feel the idea that you came up with it. And then you move your finger. And this is a really difficult study to think about for quite a while. People came along later, and basically what they said is they said, no. That readiness potential exists even way before the experiment starts, even way before I tell you whether you're going to raise your left hand or your right hand. It has nothing to do with it. And so it took a while to debunk that. But what happened is many reductionists seized on that to say there's no such thing as free will. And if there's no such thing as free will, there would be no such thing as moral responsibility, right? Yeah. It was just my brain made him shoot. I couldn't do anything. That was it. That's why I shot him. Now then, there's these other papers that are very interesting, the value of believing in free will. It turns out that encouraging beliefs in free will reduces cheating, or if you think that there's no such thing as free will, you will cheat more often. And so here's something in the paper. They basically give people the idea of whether there's cheating or not, and then increased cheating on a task occurred when people were given this pseudoscientific but authoritative sounding report that said there is no such thing as free will. So if you're told that there's no such thing as free will, you immediately start behaving badly. Wow. And if you believe in free will, you do better at your jobs, right? So this is the higher level thing driving the lower level thing. Free will is not merely just some artifact of the brain, it's actually something that matters. Okay, so back to the soul. I said I was going to basically address three things about the soul. Here's the last thing I need to talk about the soul. Is it immaterial? So we can transfer immaterial things, and we do this all the time. Yep. If I take a computer program and I put it on a thumb drive like this, I can pull it out of one computer and transfer it into another. And just so you know it's an immaterial thing, when a computer has that program installed, it weighs no more than when that computer is removed. It is the arrangement of the switches. It is the arrangement of the magnetic memory that tells you whether the computer is there or not. It's an emergent property. It's something that is caused by the information. It's not caused by the matter. Okay? So I can take this and I can pull a program out, wipe it out of one place, and put it into another. I can take it out of a PC, and if it's compatible, put it into a Mac. It can transmigrate from one thing to another. It needs to have a host of some sort, but this thing, this immaterial thing, can go to different places, and it can govern the behavior of the computer. So to return to the soul, hopefully what I've shown you is that there are immaterial things that actually cause stuff. Hopefully what I've shown you is that we do, at least in terms of science, this idea of free will is still an open possibility. And we can take something that can actually exist after our bodies and brains die if this emergent property is similar to a computer program. I haven't proven the soul, Lee. I'm sorry, I haven't done that. But I'm just trying to make it plausible so that people would be willing to consider these things. So now this is the last couple slides. Let me zoom out all the way. Let's go back out to the largest possible description of levels. And all the way at the top up here, I've had beliefs, but the thing that's missing, of course, is God. If such a higher scale exists, could it exert lower level influences? Could it be that the way to understand who we are is not just to reduce us and chop us up into little pieces and tiny little things and go ever smaller and smaller? That's the way to understand mechanism in science, is to go lower. But if you want to understand meaning, you have to go higher and higher. What's the highest possible level? I think it would be God. And could God ever exert a lower level influence? Well, here's where I come back to the first slide. Jesus is the light of the world. Yes, God could intervene in our world. I think he did in the person of Jesus Christ. I think he came down. I think he talked to us. I think he got into our world, just as I would if I meet a kid. I get down into their world. I play their game. I talk their language. He came down because he loved us. He's a higher level thing. No other God has done anything like this. The idea of being humble can only happen if you actually lower yourself, if you drop in levels. It's not an abstract virtue. So some God that you know of in some other religion is just staying up there and has always been up there. That God has not actually practiced humility and dropped levels to intervene down here where we are. So, in summary, we've talked a little bit about science and faith, how there is a tension potentially between them. I've shared a little bit about my personal journey of trying to synthesize those things, or at least harmonize them. Reductionism and neuroscience tends to chop things to smaller pieces. This is the reigning paradigm. It's not wrong, I just think it's incomplete. Emergence in physics says that when things get together, you can have new properties that emerge that are unique and not dependent entirely on the lower-level details. And from that idea, I think we have reason to believe that something like a soul could exist, and it would be very important to study that. And hopefully, some science in the future would aim in that direction. Thank you. So I think there's going to be some questions or something like that. I'm sorry I can't say there's going to be food. That would be nice. Yeah.
On your broader context, I noticed that a key thing that was missing for me at sort of the top was education. Is that under experience?
I would definitely put that under something like experience. Yeah. I could only fit so many things, and I had to really agonize over what I was going to put there. But I am an educator. I'm with you.
So the thing that I find, I don't know, missing or like the disconnect for me here is these things explain how something works, but not why something works.
Mm-hmm.
Or like if we can explain that this is sort of a behavior as it happens neurologically, but that doesn't explain things like, well, why would I choose to participate in that kind of a.
I totally agree with you.
So where is there like a link of those two things, do you think?
Yeah, so this part up here is very hard to explain. So free will, all we've done recently is basically say that the door is still open for free will. I mean, about a decade or more ago, the door was closed on that. Most neuroscientists think that there was no such thing as free will. I think that's only recently been somewhat reopened. Even now, though, most neuroscientists do not believe there is such a thing as free will. So studying the mechanisms of will, we're not there yet. Science is woefully lacking in these kinds of things. We don't understand these emergent properties. I mean, all I can understand in my work is how an avalanche emerges in a network of neurons. Next would be like how is a memory. Getting to will, I agree, we should go there. We're just not there yet.
Well, absence of free will is kind of
Yeah.
It means, what, robotic?
Sure, deterministic, and there's no hope of you changing anything. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
How you doing? I thank you for everything you shared. So I was reading, I think it was in Switch on Your Brain. Caroline Leaf was talking about a phenomenon that people could be in proximity to each other and experience something and have it register in the person next to them. Are you aware of any kind of physiological?
I don't know of anything like that right now. So, I mean, are you talking about some sort of telepathy or something like that? Or is it just being close to someone you love and feeling different?
No, I can't remember the details of the experiment, but a person thought about someone next to them, and it showed up on a scan. I don't know if anybody else read the book.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I don't know about that.
It was a prayer. Actually, specifically, it was a
Okay, I haven't seen that research
Yeah, I
yet.
haven't seen that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I mean, but such things are worth studying. I mean, you have to prove it scientifically and show. Yeah, yeah.
When you start off with the small, you start to move up the chain. Like there's a lot of things being done, say in computer science, where you're taking some of those smaller pieces, creating neural nets or line weights, and you start to add complexity up the chain. I'm just curious as to what your feeling is about that and how those simulations really are becoming more complex, and will they ever start to go up that chain to a point where you get complexity or emergent stuff happening?
Yeah, so is it possible with things like artificial intelligence and so forth to climb higher up like that? Because some of these simulations are very good. I mean, as you may know, it sounds like you do, they can beat us in chess by a lot. They can beat us in the game of Go. People thought that we wouldn't be able to have that for another 10 years. Self-driving cars, maybe, we're almost there. These things are extremely intelligent. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that this will continue to push all the way out there. I'm not necessarily saying that there's a mystery that couldn't ever be explained in terms of the lower level things. All I'm saying is that whatever is up here, because we can't understand it on our scientific terms yet, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean it's not important. It is there. Science could eventually get there. I have no necessarily problem with saying that it could eventually get there. Yeah. And it's moving very fast right now, for sure. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was great.
Thanks.
I'm very interested in the will part and
Yeah.
how I'm also interested in addiction
Sure.
and how can biology can it override the will of that person that has this condition, for example?
Yeah. Now, I'm not an expert in addiction, but I do know that there are some circumstances where it seems to be almost overwhelming, and even if the person's will is extremely strong, they can't, they'll succumb. And it depends on the person's history and all sorts of things. So, yeah, I think we need to have compassion on people who are in those situations. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not able. I'm sure there's a battle going on there. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Can you expand a little bit more on the experiment that you said scientists did, where he was stimulating different parts of the brain, and the person said, "I didn't raise my arm." What does that say about the existence of a self that is separate from our brains?
Yeah, so Wilder Penfield did these experiments in the 50s, I think, and one of the things he concluded is that the self is different from just this mechanism. It's like what you've done is you pop the hood, and now you're able to sort of like mess with the spark plugs or cause the engine to rev or things like that, but you're not the driver. The driver is in there somewhere, and the driver is somehow that thing that initiates, I will raise my arm. And that's what I'm hoping is, if there is a soul that we can somehow eventually define a little bit more clearly, it would have to do with that. It would have to do with the idea that I decided to marry Sarah, for example. Those types of decisions would be typed that. But yes, he felt that he couldn't find it, no matter where he stimulated, no matter what he did. He couldn't do that. Yeah, sure.
What was the free will study when they're saying it wasn't free will because it wasn't until a couple seconds that they decided to point the finger up?
Yeah.
And then combined with those other two articles that said, when it was introduced that you have no free will, people were more morally corrupt, and when people said they had free will, they wanted to work better.
Yeah, okay, so the first study was just the simplest possible case of will, like do you want to raise your finger or not? And what he tried to do is study both the muscle and the brain waves in that case. Now, the reason why that's not a very good thing, I think, is because it's too reduced. As you may know, when you do something very, very often, it becomes automatic and almost not subject to your will. Have you ever driven home late at night and you pull into your driveway and you go, how did I get here? I have no memory of driving this way, right? Okay, because you're so good at it, right? When somebody first plays this game of Tetris, remember when the blocks come down and you have to sort of like move and get them all to stack in? They do brain scans on people when they first play the game of Tetris and they've never been experienced with that game. Their whole brain lights up. Everything's like, wah! You know, it's like chaos. But when they become very, very good at Tetris, very small regions of their brain light up. And they can practically do it in text and drive at the same time, right? You know, so they can, it's just, no, not in this state, I hear. Okay, but the idea is that once something becomes very automatic, it takes up less and less mental activity, okay? So what I think would be an interesting thing to study is not something that's relatively automatic. Like raising my finger is pretty darn automatic. What would be much, much less automatic if you zoom out, you zoom out, you zoom out, is something like, should I cheat on my tax returns or not? That would be a really interesting thing to study in people, right? To find out, you know, what are their circumstances? What is the broader context? Those are more akin to what I would say are free will. They have a moral component to them. This doesn't have much of a moral component. It's not a very interesting thing. And so it's not surprising to me that they found that to be almost automatic. But the pre-potential, the thing that kind of started to take off before they moved their finger, the argument was, aha, you see that wave rising? That rise occurred, you know, a third of a second before the person even thought they made the decision. So it must be that their brain is doing that for them. And then after the fact, they have the illusion or the impression that they decided. So free will is nothing but a feeling that we have, it's an illusion. That was the argument. And then they did further studies, they investigated it, they debunked it, and then they found, other people did, that your belief in free will actually affects your behavior. Does that help explain?
So it got debunked, this whole...
Well, let me be careful. Even if something is debunked, that doesn't mean that the field immediately grabs it and says, oh yeah, we believe this, okay? Here's an example, continental drift. You notice how South America fits in with Africa, okay? This guy named Wegener came up with the idea of continental drift. Everybody thought he was wrong for decades, decades, decades. Then he died. And after he died, then they believed it. Okay, so sometimes it takes a while. The saying is, all the old scientists first have to die before a new idea is really fully accepted. Okay, and so this idea that we actually have free will, there's this science out there showing that this is still a live option. And I think it should be examined. I think it should be studied in more detail. But if scientists don't think it exists, they're not going to study it. And certainly funding agencies aren't going to fund you for that. They all say things like, I want you to cure Parkinson's or Huntington's or whatever. Free will? Yeah, that's a philosophical question. We're not going to fund that. And so our knowledge about these things is largely, I would argue, reduced because the reign of reductionism is so strong right now. And I think it may take decades before this begins to basically undo itself. But I don't think it's good. I mean, reductionism isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. There's more to it than that. Yeah, back here.
Hi. So you're arguing that the soul is an emergent property of the brain. And kind of like other emergent properties like the wave and the computer program.
Sure.
Well, the wave wouldn't be able to exist without the people, and the computer program wouldn't be able to exist without the computer.
Sure.
So what makes you think that the soul can exist without the brain?
Yeah, excellent question. I think it does have to have some sort of substrate or host or something that it's in. It definitely interacts with matter. So if I were to take, let's say, I don't know, a thumb drive and stick it into my temporal lobe and suck my soul out and plug it into Lee Cowan back there or something like that, I mean, it would have to go into a body. It would have to go into something where it could have that substrate and interact. All I'm willing to say at the moment is that it needs something. Now, there's lots of stuff out there that could be beyond our knowledge right now, but all I want to say is that it's the arrangement of things that could be transported from one spot to another. It's not identical with the body. It could be removed and put into another body, at least if it's similar to a computer program. I'm happy to hear.
Yes, I'm just wondering where this body would be.
Where the soul, like if I die, where does my soul go?
Exactly.
Oh yeah, I don't know yet. I don't know. I mean, so here's the thing. Let me just give you a quick glimpse of the vastness of our ignorance. I don't know if you know about the current budget of matter in astrophysics. So we used to think, we looked out there and we said, okay, we calculate all these solar masses and all these stars and so forth. We know how much a galaxy has mass. And it turns out that there's this other stuff called dark matter, and there's this other stuff called dark energy. And so if you add up all the dark matter and all the dark energy, all the matter that we actually know of right now is probably somewhere like 5 to 7%. The other 93% of stuff right now, it's almost a joke in physics, we have no idea what it is. But we know it's there because it's changing the rotational speed of galaxies. It's bending light in a way that's far different from what it would have been if we only had those stars there. So there's dark matter in this room, but we don't even know what it is. I don't know where it is, I don't know how it is, okay? So I'm not trying to say that the soul then goes into dark matter. Don't quote me on that. I'm just trying to say the amount that we don't know is enormous. And all I'm trying to do is present the idea that you could have an immaterial thing that could transport into something else. I don't know what that other thing is. You caught me red-handed. I have no idea. But if it is, it could then be transported someplace else. So it's open in the future. Yeah.
How do you feel about the thought that rather than the soul being like its own entity, actually created our subconscious to figure out and explain how it is people individually, internally, externally, and as a society?
So is it some sort of thing that our subconscious generates? And it's very sensitive to the what society thinks. So it's sort of like a superego type thing, but also an id. It's buried down there. I don't know it's there, but it's also paying attention. I mean, it could be. I'm open to these things. You'd have to do research on that. You'd have to see if that's the case. So the way to proceed would be to say, okay, here's the hypothesis, here are the predictions, and let's test them and see how they go. I mean, at this point, you have to be totally honest. We don't know enough about the soul at all scientifically to say, here's what it is. All I can do is basically say, here's my personal journey and trying to argue with myself in my own mind about what might be there. Because part of me as a scientist, being surrounded by all these other reductionists, says that there could not be a soul. And then I think there ought to be a soul, and so I try to think about how there could be a soul. So all I've done is basically argue that there could be a soul, given the physics about emergent properties and given what we know about how these scales interact. Exactly what it is, that's yet to be determined. Right? All I'm doing is leaving the door open. I'm not trying to say I have the object in hand. I don't. I absolutely don't. And if I give that impression, I retract it right now. Yeah.
So, what you're saying, a lot of the neuroscientists really just think everything originates from the bottom and everything kind of builds up. So, if you just take that out to the logical conclusion, of all the artificial intelligence, all the smarter and smarter things that we're building, we become more and more like, build more like a human brain.
Yeah.
So one day,
yeah,
like that incredibly intelligent car will all of a sudden realize that I'm my own car. I don't have to just follow this road. I can make my own choice. And then eventually, when it gets to Oxycontin, it would see a red car.
That would be a really
bad
Oxycontin would be if you get the wrong side of town.
But one day you'd see a red car and say, I really like that red car. I'm going to start following that red car.
Yeah.
So, without something up there guiding it, just the small things, all of a sudden, they'll become self-aware and make their own decisions and follow. Because obviously, without that higher thing, that is the only way to go. That's the only way that we develop, like what we should do. Not only no, I should help that person. I should help that car on the road.
Yeah.
And go back and love them. So that's the only pathway to get to where we are, which is the only way to get there if there's nothing above that's giving us.
It's very conceivable that if you continue on the path of artificial intelligence, these things will become self-aware, and maybe they will even develop souls. I have no idea, right? But I have my own religious views about whether that is going to happen or not. But right now, I'm mostly trying to talk just about what the science tells us or not. So yes, that's an open.
But that's what the neuroscientists that don't believe in any kind of higher power. That's really the only way you can get to the way we are. It's just eventually just happen. Who knows when?
Yeah.
But eventually, you have enough of those synapses that you start making your own decisions. You start loving, and you start.
Okay. Sure. Have you seen this movie Ex Machina?
No.
It's an interesting one. It's about artificial intelligence and what happens if you get something that's human-like in its intelligence.
I've seen The Terminator. Is that?
Yeah, that's where I am. That's where I am. Come on.
It's a good movie, but not the point that I was
Awesome.
emphasizing. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
So I'm not sure if you can answer this, but I'm thinking about, the reductionist and the idea that there's no free will. So if there's no free will, does that take away accountability? I mean, certainly, I can't help that this is the brain I have. My brain is making bad choices. I mean, certainly, how do you?
Yeah. Certainly philosophers are far more qualified to talk about this than me, but most philosophers that I've read, philosophers of mind, would agree that if there is no such thing as free will, then moral accountability goes out the window, right? I mean, it makes no sense to punish someone for something they could not have done otherwise, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and so it makes no sense to talk about what's right or wrong. It makes no sense to teach your kids anything. It's all just let it go. Yeah, let it go.
So that's sort of that's a belief that
people often don't want to talk about that. Well, let me give you a quick example. So we've had all kinds of people over to our house, professors of informatics who study computer science and so forth, and we got into a discussion. And this guy basically said, yeah, no, there's no such thing as right or wrong. I said, so you don't think murder is wrong? He said, to tell you the truth, no, I don't think it's wrong. So now people won't often say that in public, but in private, to be intellectually consistent, they will say that. They will say that there is no such thing as right or wrong. There's a lot of people who hold that view who are getting paid by the state teaching at universities like this. Just to let you know. Okay, so that is going on for sure. And I think they're intellectually consistent, but I think what it does is it produces a huge discrepancy with what we experience in our day-to-day life. In my day-to-day life, I think there are things that are right and wrong. And that's a natural belief to fall into, and it would take a huge amount for me to be persuaded that is just an illusion. Right? I'm not willing to go there. All right, so, we had an interesting discussion, and my wife kind of put her hand on my shoulder and said, honey, we're social here. Don't get into it with them. But I agree. I don't think that's a viable way to go. Let's see, you already, yeah.
Just to piggyback off of my friend back there.
Yeah.
Do you believe that a soul needs a living entity to, have it in it?
To possess.
Yeah.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on reincarnation? Because, if we die and our soul leaves our body, it needs a place to go. What are your thoughts on reincarnation?
So there's two parts to me, right? There's the part that is the neuroscience and physics part, and that's really who's on tonight. And what I would say is this view doesn't really have anything negative to say about that. It leaves the door open for that. Okay? My Christian self, though, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards about that. Yeah, I definitely have views on reincarnation. As far as the science goes, I'm just trying to argue that that is a possibility. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So kind of jumping off of the last round we said there. So if there's no free will, would the argument be that there's no universal moral criterion to base off of that right or wrong is? We would just, I don't know, because if there's free will, you can make your own decision, right? And have that moral criterion, create anything you want. But without free will, there is no moral criterion. So is that what? So is that what they're arguing?
Yeah. I mean, most people who hold that view often also adopt the idea that morals are something that have been evolutionarily sort of impressed upon our society to improve its survival skills. Right. So as a group, those societies that had altruism will outcompete those that don't have altruism. That's the idea. And so it is a way of tricking us. It's a way of fooling us into thinking that this is good behavior, when in fact there's no such thing as right or wrong. It's just going to help the society to survive.
So guilt would be like an evolutionary base.
Yeah, from that perspective. But here's an interesting thing to think about with that point of view is if you can't trust your feelings of good or right or wrong, if evolution has just programmed them into you, why then should you trust your logic or your rationality to come to the conclusion that evolution works? Right? I mean, so what you're doing is you're saying, oh, I've been tricked by evolution. But once you do that, you saw off the very branch you're sitting on, right? Yeah. You're basically saying all my thoughts are suspect because evolution is just telling me to think this way. So that has its own problems. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Well, thanks.
So I'm kind of confused on just so if our morality cannot be
little box up there is saying that if meaning comes from going to higher and higher context, what's the most meaning I could ever have? The most meaning I could ever have is if there is a supreme being who actually loves me. And the most meaning comes from a relationship. So it's in contrast to that you that I had from Pride and Prejudice. If you only see the word you, the meaning is impoverished. But if I go to bigger and bigger context, the you has more and more meaning. And so I'd love to talk about whether I think there is a God or not. But for our purposes tonight, all I'm doing is saying there might be something there. Can you come on Sunday? I'm going to talk about these types of things. So if you're willing to do that, we can get into it. Or I can talk afterwards. I'm happy to discuss. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Hi. I've got a question. I guess it's a little bigger than the topic.
Okay.
The whole idea of value of analyzing all this stuff scientifically and almost holding it as a division. The fact that somebody can sort of prove something scientifically has such enormous validity. And it's really great that you can go and use their scientific process and analyze it scientifically and come to things that are challenges. But I just wonder how valid you would say would be even to hold the scientific process as being that valid way of analyzing.
Is the scientific process a valid way of analyzing these things? Is that what you're asking?
Say that again?
Is the scientific process a valid way of analyzing these things?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the scientific process is something that a lot of people believe that's the only way we can know truth, right? That's what a lot of people say. It can't be the only way we know truth, right? It can't be. Okay, and let me just prove it to you real quickly. The sentence, there is no such thing as absolute truth. So that sentence self-contradicts. So that means it's false. What that therefore means is that there is absolute truth. Now, I don't necessarily know what that absolute truth is, but I know it's there somewhere. Okay, it at least exists. Okay, how did I know that? I knew that through logic. I didn't know that by doing an experiment here. I knew that by logic. Even the idea that we should do science is metaphysics before you start doing the experiment. Okay, so the idea that science is the only way of knowing, that's not a scientific statement. That's actually a philosophical statement. Okay, so science is good for learning a lot of these types of things, but it's incomplete. I mean, otherwise all of mathematics would be just thrown out the door, right? I mean, mathematics often has no experimental component. It's just proving things in number theory and so forth. Fermat's last theorem, is that valid or not? It's valid. It was proved. Is it knowledge? I think it is knowledge. Is it true? It's truth. Well, was it experimental? No, it wasn't. Now, I don't know. Am I answering your question at all?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Let's see. Let me get other people who haven't. Yeah.
Yes. I'm still caught up on free will. How would
Yeah, sure.
How would free will be compatible with something like Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, where somebody has a genetic disorder that causes them to eat their own flesh? I mean, who would choose that? How do we have free will?
No, I mean, and I think in some cases like that, maybe there isn't much free will, right? I mean, maybe there's free will in other. Okay, so I don't know if you could all hear, but there's some genetic disorder that I haven't heard of where people eat their own flesh. And if that's overwhelming and it's compelling, I mean, I don't think necessarily people would have free will. If there is coercion in the law, we often say that a person was not free to sign that contract. If someone said, I'll kill your kids if you don't sign this contract, it's thrown out in the court of law because it's not really free will, right? It was done under coercion. I am absolutely open to the idea that there are extremely powerful biological mechanisms that effectively would coerce someone beyond, I'd never want to be in a situation like that. How could you blame a person for doing what they did if the pressure on them biologically was so extreme? I'm not necessarily saying that free will always exists. All I want to say is that this idea that came from some neuroscientists that free will just ought to be thrown out the door and then no such free will ever exists, I want to combat that and say that no, the door is still open. But I definitely agree with you if something's compelling to that level, no. I mean, I don't think people are free to act under those circumstances. Does that address what you asked? Okay, sure. Yeah.
Can you define the soul? What is a soul?
What is a soul?
What are the qualities of the soul?
So you'll notice that I was very, very cautious to only say 3 things about the soul, right? So I think the things that I said is that it's immaterial, okay? So it needs to be in matter to exist, but it itself is not material. It can be transported from one spot to another. So it's immaterial. It is the source of our will. So somehow it is involved with our decisions. And the other thing is that it can be transported from one thing to another. It doesn't necessarily, it's not united with my body. It's not identical with my body. My body could die, and this other thing, this emergent property, could potentially be transported someplace else.
Can it die with your body?
Possibly if it had no place to jump to. Yeah. I mean, according to the picture I've painted, if this emergent thing, okay, so let's say there was no thumb drive and the computer went down and it was destroyed, the program is lost. Yeah, conceivably. I guess the way I've painted it. I didn't think about that. That's a clever thing. Yeah, but I'm just, all I'm doing is trying to paint a picture of the possibility of this kind of thing, given the science we currently have.
Animals have souls?
Ooh, I'd like to think my dog has a soul. Yeah, he's a very heart-seeing being. And again, this is beyond the scope of what I want to talk about tonight. Yeah. Yes?
Have you ever heard of the connectome?
Yeah, sure.
So going back to the God module kind of experiment, do you think that if the connectome was more accurate and more, done properly, I guess, like later on in the future, would we be able to have pinpoint exactly what the God module area of the brain might be?
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, first of all, the little movie I showed with the sphere rotating, that was made by Olaf Sporns. He was the guy who wrote the paper, along with 2 other colleagues, where they coined the term connectome. And he is a very well-known person who applies network science to the brain. Could there be a module or a location in the brain or in the cortex that is receptive to God in the same way that, let's say, there's a module in the temporal fusiform gyrus that is sensitive to faces? Why not? Could be. I have nothing against it. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily mean that God exists only in that little temporal lobe module. What that means is that the cells there are somehow responsible for receiving or understanding certain aspects of God. That's quite possible. Just as there are certain cells in my visual stream that recognize Sarah Beggs, my wife, right? I mean, I think there's a correspondence between things externally and things internally represented in my brain. So yeah, God is not those neurons, but there are probably neurons that are involved in understanding who God is, at least my understanding of God. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, way in the back.
Do you believe that the wave is external or internal, as in is the wave all around us or in each of our own personal brains?
The wave, kind of like the little wave that's going on. So I think that all I wanted to do was argue that there are these little things traveling around in our brain, these emergent patterns of firings of neurons, kind of like almost the starling flock that's going on in our brain. And whether that could skip out and go to other people's brains or not, I have no idea. But all I'm content to believe in right now is that there are emergent things happening in my brain right now, and that has to do with the arrangement of the neurons that I have and the information that those neurons have, and that's massless. But yeah, that's an interesting idea. Maybe there's something that floats around, but we haven't gotten there yet. I don't know. It could be. Yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about patterns, and I kind of was hoping that you were going to be able to say, hey, here's this pattern, here's the cool flock of birds, and then somehow connect that to our something that connected to God or something that was that. And there's
I'd like to do that.
Yeah, there's a neurobiologist in Stanford named William Newsom out of Stanford University, and he doesn't really do anything differently. He was just talking about his tension between this. But do you see anything on the horizon that you're saying, yeah, we're seeing some patterns that are coming out? Because when we're looking for meaning, religion talking about our faith, we're looking for meaning that develops a pattern of why we do what we do in order to develop our faith. In engineering, when I studied, it's something practical that I apply to what I do for work. Yes. And trying to relate those two wasn't necessarily difficult as what you're trying to attempt. But is there something, alluding to a pattern that you're seeing develop that you can't, I can't put paper to pencil, but I'm seeing a pattern develop that kind of alludes to, God's handprint on this thing?
Yeah, okay, so 2 comments on that. First of all, Bill Newsom, I know him, we've talked about this kind of stuff. He is at the forefront of basically sharing his Christian faith as a neuroscientist. He is vastly more accomplished than me. He is awesome. He's in the National Academy of Sciences. He's the I guess, the chair of the Department of Neurosciences at Stanford. He's way up in the echelon. So the basic idea of can we apply it? Can we say that there's some idea of God represented in the brain? There have been brain scans of people who are thinking about God and people who don't think about God. There's scans of people who routinely pray and those who don't. And there have been studies to try to see the differences in these things at the macro scale. And there are differences, okay? People are trying to quantify this stuff, but this type of work is in its infancy. It's very, very early on. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to kind of go in and find differences in the brains of people who believe and people who don't believe. I'm totally open to that. I don't think, when you talk about God, it doesn't have to be, oh, that's it, there's a gap, there's a mystery, well, science will never go there. I'm not of that opinion. I think science could go there. And when science arrives there, that doesn't necessarily invalidate God either. Right? It both could be true. I mean, I think God is probably going to be very consistent with the laws that he created.
That's good.
Yeah, so I don't think, but no, we're not anywhere near the point of engineering our brains to believe in God, or if that's what you were hoping for. No practical application, I just get funded to think.
That's good. That's awesome.
Maybe one more question. Yeah, sure, okay. One more question. Somebody who hasn't asked a question before. Yeah, over here. Who wants, you fight it out between the two of you.
She's my wife.
Oh yeah, excellent move. Yes. What would you like to ask?
There's a white
or thought about any research in near-death experiences where people say, I died, my soul went to heaven, but I can look at my body and know that that was still my body on earth.
Yeah.
And to scientifically, because people don't believe it because they can't say, well, scientifically how can we prove that? It's all based on anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, right.
Stories. But to be able to take the soul out of the body and have the soul recognize the body still, I mean that soul has to have a source of being beyond just that body.
Yeah. So those are fascinating to me, and I'd like to get into that. Near-death experiences, and there's lots of people who are starting to try to study that kind of thing, and it's mostly from the realm of psychology. The closest that I can come to it, and Lee and I were talking about this earlier, is to take a frog, and around here, this is definitely what frogs do in the wintertime, is they bury in the mud under there, and they freeze, and they shut down. And their neurons are not firing at all. Wow. And if there's any kind of little soul thing in that animal, it's gone, right? But what happens is when the spring comes, they basically come back to life. Right? I would love to record all their neurons and find out who starts firing first, what are the emergent patterns of activity, how does it propagate out from some core. I don't know how it's going to do this, but that would be something that you could study. Now, I can't interrogate the frog and say, where were you? Were you leaping through lily pads and, grabbing flies, and then you were wolf in the mud? I don't know what it would be like, but that would be a start. And I think turning science to these kinds of questions is perfectly fair game and ought to be done. One of the reasons why it's not done more often is because scientists think that once you start talking about stuff like that we can't easily quantify, they think you're on shaky ground, you're a kook, you're a crackpot, just get out of here. Okay, so that's, oh, well, if you've been through it, I'd love to talk with you. Yeah, so I'm not doubting those types of experiences. I think they should be quantified, but science just hasn't caught up with that yet. And I'm totally open to that kind of thing goes on. Absolutely. So thank you very much, everybody, for all your questions.